Welcome to UnDrowning, where I share my story of surfacing after years of drowning my soul with alcohol, and how I found the love, liberation, and purpose waiting for me above the water. I'm Noelle, and today I would like to talk about what recovery actually is, or at least as far as I understand it. So before we dive into what recovery means, I want to take a moment and make what I believe is a very important distinction: the difference between sobriety and recovery. Sobriety, at its most basic level, is the act of not drinking, not using, or not engaging in a behavior or with a substance that once controlled you. It's a condition of absence, the absence of the substance, the absence of that behavior. Sobriety is the thing people will usually notice in you first because it's visible. It is a change that can be measured. You can mark it by time, like, I've been sober for 30 days, or I've been sober for 2 years. And that, in and of itself, is a huge accomplishment. But sobriety is only the beginning. Recovery goes deeper. Recovery isn't just about what you stop doing. It's more about what you start doing. It's about doing the work to heal the root causes, rebuilding trust in yourself, rediscovering who you really are, and creating a life for yourself that actually feels worth living. So, the way I see it at least, sobriety removes the substance. Recovery restores the soul. So today, I'd like to share with you how I see recovery as a soul retrieval, a rediscovering of the self, and devotion. I will also be touching on some of the teachings of Carl Jung, as well as spiritual traditions from around the world that echo this truth. Addiction is about escape. It's about numbing or turning away from pain. And as I mentioned in a previous episode, pain doesn't just disappear or go away when we ignore it. It festers and infects us, creating even more complications for us on an emotional, psychological, spiritual, and even physical level. When we stop using substances to escape our pain, it's not like all of our problems magically disappear. What most of us find when we finally reach the point of sobriety and can abstain from escaping through substance abuse is that now we feel all of it. All of that pain and suffering we tried to stave off comes bubbling up to the surface, just begging to be acknowledged and felt. And just from my personal experience of what this is like, it's not for the faint of heart. But what I feel I can confidently say for those of us who have struggled with addiction is that we are not faint of heart. We are survivors. We are people who found ways to adapt and keep ourselves alive even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against us. Just the fact that we are still here means that we never truly gave up on ourselves. And that alone shows just how tenacious and capable we are. So when I stopped drinking, I definitely felt so much relief and hope and gratitude, like I was saying in the last episode, but I quickly realized that I had so much work to do. And I know I spent a lot of the last episode discussing all of the beneficial things that I did to support my recovery and all of these very uplifting and lovely things, but I want to make it very clear that it was not all sunshine and rainbows. I stopped drinking and suddenly had decades of trauma to process. It wasn't going to be just about stopping the escape. I had to actively choose to turn toward the pain, to turn toward myself. Recovery is choosing to be fully present, even when it hurts. Recovery is facing our shadow, the parts of ourselves or our story that we've denied or rejected, and inviting them back into the light. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung gave us language that resonates deeply with the journey of recovery. One of his central ideas was something he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are by integrating all the lost or fragmented parts of the psyche. It is the ultimate journey of self-realization and transformation. Addiction often begins as a way to numb or avoid those split-off parts of ourselves. Recovery invites us to turn toward them with compassion. Jung referred to these fragmented aspects as the shadow. In analytical psychology, it is an archetype that represents the unconscious mind, where we hold our repressed thoughts, feelings, and desires, where the neglected and rejected parts of ourselves live. Jung believed that in order to reach a state of greater wholeness, authenticity, and psychological fulfillment, we must integrate these shadow elements into our conscious awareness. This process of individuation is lifelong, but leads to much greater satisfaction as we move beyond the false mask of our persona and into our truest, most unified self. I personally feel as though the process of individuation and the journey of recovery are one and the same. Jung once suggested that addiction was, at its core, a spiritual thirst, or what he called a craving for wholeness. In a famous letter to Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung referred to this longing for transcendence as spiritus contra spiritum, which translates to the spirit against the spirit. He believed that alcohol was being used as a substitute for spiritual experience, and that the spiritual thirst must be confronted by a true spiritual experience rather than alcohol. This idea that an alcoholic's craving was an unconscious expression of a spiritual need for what one could call a union with God was profoundly influential on the founders of AA and its emphasis on a spiritual solution. Recovery is not just about putting down the drink. It's about finding the true spirit, the real source of connection and transcendence. And honestly, this has really been the biggest motivation for me to keep on this path, my need for spiritual connection. I've been a spiritual person for as long as I can remember, really. I wasn't raised religious or in any church community. Or I guess we went to church when I was very, very little, but my parents stopped taking us when the church was starting to preach how what they believed was right and true, and anyone who didn't believe the same things would burn in hell. I remember my mom telling me when I was older that she didn't want to raise us to have that kind of mindset. And I appreciate that so much and feel extremely grateful to have not been raised around those views. I know so many who suffered and still struggle with religious trauma, and have seen how insidious and complex that type of trauma can be. But despite not being raised with any real emphasis on God or spirituality, I've always had this deep knowing that something profoundly meaningful and spectacular existed that was beyond my comprehension. I have always felt the presence and pull of the mystery. I actually remember a time when I was maybe 11 or so, and my dad asked me if I believed in God. I told him that I did, but that I didn't think God was a man in the sky or a person at all, but that I believed God was that feeling you get when you look up at the night sky and there are thousands of stars and you're filled with this sense of wonder and belonging, or the feeling you get from being held by someone you love. And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly what I said as a child, but I do remember telling him that I believed God was a feeling and that it was a feeling of connection and love. I think when we're young, we're so much more aware of this type of innate wisdom, so much closer to it, at least when we're in environments that encourage the freedom to think and believe what feels true to us rather than being told what to believe. And I feel very fortunate to have been given this freedom as a child, because I believe that this is what helped me to create such a strong spiritual foundation that thankfully I've held on to all this time and now serves as a key ally in my recovery, and was one of the most appealing things about sobriety to me. The opportunity to reconnect with my spirituality and myself, which, in my understanding, are both the same thing. The self is not separate from the spirit. I think that spirituality often gets framed as a connection to something beyond or larger than yourself, which in a sense is true, but I think that many people interpret this to mean something outside of themselves, something separate. But this separation is an illusion. What we seek outside of ourselves also exists within us. The divine intelligence we crave connection and communion with is the very same spark that ignites and drives our own soul. For me, drinking alcohol kept me from this sense of spiritual connection and fulfillment because it kept me from myself. At least, it kept me from fully experiencing and honoring my own wholeness, my divinity. So if I look at recovery through a spiritual lens, which for me is impossible not to, then I see that recovery is about returning to wholeness, to union with the divine, and to the core essence of who I really am. Many traditions across the world speak to this same journey, each in their own language and frame of understanding. Buddhism identifies craving and attachment as the root of suffering. In recovery, addiction is seen as craving intensified to the point of destruction. The Buddhist path offers freedom from this through mindfulness and compassion, inviting us to notice our urges without being consumed by them. It's a practice of coming home to ourselves with awareness and presence, dissolving suffering at its root. Hinduism reminds us that beneath all the layers of confusion and pain, the true self is divine. Addiction creates forgetfulness around that truth, while recovery acts as a sacred remembering. Hindu practices like devotion, meditation, and service bring us back into harmony with and connection to the universal spirit, or Brahman. Christian teachings emphasize surrender, renewal, and rebirth. Recovery mirrors this process. The movement from an old life marked by suffering and strife into a new life filled with grace and hope echoes the Christian idea of dying to the old self and being reborn as a new self, created in righteousness and holiness. Sufi mysticism speaks of the journey from ego toward the heart's union with God. Recovery could be viewed as this same process, as a shifting away from isolation and self-centeredness toward surrender and divine intimacy. In Sufism, the ultimate goal is to seek the pleasure of God by working to return to one's original, primordial state of purity, known as fitra. In Taoism, we are taught to live in harmony with the Tao, or the Way, by embracing simplicity, effortless action, the balance of yin and yang energy, and by cultivating what are referred to as the three treasures of Taoism, which are compassion, frugality, and humility. Taoist wisdom teaches that suffering arises when we resist the natural flow of life. Addiction is this disharmony. It is an energetic clinging rather than allowing and trusting. Recovery is a return to balance, flowing again in rhythm with the Tao, the universal way that carries all things in perfect, effortless harmony. It is a practice of simplicity, humility, and of letting go. And many indigenous teachings describe illness or addiction as a loss of connection from community, from the natural world, from our ancestors, or from spirit. This view suggests that healing, then, is not just an individual process, but also a communal one. Looking at recovery through an indigenous lens, we could see it as a reweaving of relationship with the earth, with others, and with the sacred web of life, a reconnection to sacred relationship. There have been several studies and influential research projects that strongly suggest that a lack of social connection or meaningful relationships, as well as a feeling of disconnection, are major factors in addiction. Research shows that loneliness and isolation significantly increase the risk for substance abuse and relapse. Community, and really just a general feeling of connection and belonging, is essential to our ability to thrive. We as humans have a fundamental biological need for community and social connection. This need developed in our early history as a means of survival through reproduction and protection. We needed to work cooperatively, or we literally would not have survived. Our brains evolved to support complex social interactions, and these interactions are supported by neurochemical processes that involve oxytocin and serotonin, neurotransmitters that significantly impact mood, trust, and overall well-being. What this tells me is that a crucial aspect of recovery is cultivating and nurturing meaningful relationships. And what's really cool about that, at least something that I'm experiencing, is that in doing so, I am simultaneously deepening my relationship with myself. By engaging more authentically and intimately with the people in my life, I'm learning more about myself than I've ever known before. Or at least, maybe I'm able to see myself more clearly and reach a new depth of self-understanding. All relationships are like mirrors, where others reflect back parts of us that we might not be able to see on our own. When we engage intimately with others, whether it's friendship, family, or romantic partnership, patterns emerge. How we communicate, or maybe how we struggle to, what we fear, how we love, where we withhold. These things can only be illuminated through our relationships with others, can only be reflected back to us when we are actively engaging in relationship. And even though some of these patterns and behaviors can be extremely uncomfortable to acknowledge and even more uncomfortable to own, these reflections are offering us the opportunity to recognize our shadow and identify what within us is asking to be known. This mirror aspect of relationships is probably one of the more frustrating and upsetting elements of relationships for a lot of people. I know that it has been for me. Most of us would much rather pin the blame for all the trouble in our relationship on the other person rather than have to admit to our own shortcomings. But the truth is that we are all flawed, perfectly imperfect, just as we are meant to be, and to deny that we have any work to do on ourselves only keeps us from having those deep, meaningful, authentic connections that are so essential to our ability to thrive. And it keeps those aspects of ourselves, our shadow, from coming to the light. But if instead we are open to learning to be consciously aware of our reactions and our responses to situations and other people, then we can gain insight into the nature of our shadow and in doing so, cultivate self-awareness. In his book, Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, Carl Jung said, quote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge." End quote. And since we're on the topic of the shadow again, I feel like it's important to note that the shadow is not solely negative, but also contains positive qualities that have been repressed. Creativity, spontaneity, and silliness are a few that are often denied or repressed because of a belief that these qualities are unacceptable or undesirable. Some aspects are pushed down to avoid standing out, going against the status quo, or having to deal with the fear of rejection. So I just wanted to clarify, the shadow is not a bad thing or a good thing. It is simply all of the things we chose to deny for whatever reason. But when we remain fully unaware of it, it dictates our lives, unconsciously driving our thoughts, feelings, patterns, and habits, shaping our experiences in the world. So it isn't bad or evil, but it is powerful. And learning to notice and recognize it consciously is crucial if we truly want to be in right relationship with ourselves and others. So going back to some of the ways that nurturing meaningful relationships with others can help us deepen our relationship to ourselves and how these relationships are so important on our recovery journey. Something that has been coming up for me a lot lately, and is something that I've been actively working on in recovery, is that I've come to realize that for so much of my life, I haven't offered myself nearly the same level of compassion or grace that I would a friend. When it comes to others, it's seemingly effortless for me to extend my love, care, and empathy. But with myself, it doesn't come as naturally. And for much of my life, I've met myself with harsh criticism and judgment. I used to speak so horribly to myself, ways in which I wouldn't dream of speaking to someone I care about. But in the last year or so, I've really been working to retrain myself to speak with the voice in my mind as I would speak to a dear friend. And it has also inspired me to really pay attention to the ways I care for and respond to the people in my life, which not only helps create a dynamic where I'm actively working to stay on top of speaking with integrity and authenticity, but it also serves to help me in rebuilding the architecture of my own inner voice. The way I relate to those I love is teaching me how to relate to myself. Relationships are catalysts for growth. The conversations, co-creation, and even conflicts that we share with others can spark insights that touch us deeply and inspire change. Sometimes someone else's wisdom that they've chosen to share with me resonates so profoundly that it feels like they've unlocked some deeper, dormant truth within me, or struck a chord that fills me with such pure inspiration. Much of what I experience and learn from the relationships in my life is what motivates me to become the best version of myself that I can possibly be. I have also noticed that the more I share my joy and enthusiasm with others, the more connected I feel to my inner child, that wounded and lost little girl who still exists within me as a very real aspect of who I am. She heals more and more whenever I connect playfully with others. Every time it feels safe to be silly and goofy, every time I laugh uncontrollably, every time I feel truly accepted to just be the weird little girl that I've always been, I heal. I heal and I reclaim all of those childlike, carefree aspects of my inner world. So something I've really been coming to understand through my recovery journey is that, at least in my own experience, nurturing and maintaining meaningful and fulfilling relationships with others goes hand in hand with nurturing and maintaining my relationship with myself and deepening my capacity for self-awareness. Just as I believe that the journey of recovery and the individuation process go hand in hand and are one and the same. Recovery is not abstract. Recovery is lived. It is something I can embody and that I anchor into my reality through practices and rituals that keep me connected to myself, to the earth, and to others. I know I spoke about some of these in my last episode, but I wanted to go over the key practices that I've maintained throughout recovery that are so important to me. First and foremost, I have to mention meditation. I truly believe that staying consistent with this practice has been my greatest ally when it came to resetting my nervous system and keeping me at a far more regulated baseline. Next, which is really tie for first with meditation, is gratitude. And I honestly think I'll do a whole episode on gratitude sometime because I could just go on and on about how transformative and powerful the influence of gratitude can be. It brings me even more into my heart and retrains my mind to notice beauty and abundance instead of despair or lack. This mindset shift has been truly life-changing for me. Another important practice for me has been creative expression. Singing, dancing, drawing, writing, these are all such potent medicine. I believe that every time we create, we are sharing a piece of our soul, making an offering of sacred expression to the collective. This is not only healing for us, but healing for all. Another key component to my recovery is my inner work, which, of course, my meditation and gratitude practices are a big part of that. But this also includes shadow work, which is essentially the work to integrate the repressed aspects of myself by becoming consciously aware of them and accepting them. I would actually really love to work with a Jungian analyst, which is a licensed psychotherapist who specializes in Jungian depth psychology and basically works with clients to assist them and guide them on their journey of individuation. They help their clients gain more insight into their psyche by helping them explore their unconscious through dream analysis, active imagination, understanding archetypes and other symbols, and helping bring their unconscious to their conscious awareness. But until I find and can afford to work with a Jungian analyst, I do my best to intuitively analyze my dreams, as well as working with the tarot quite regularly. I also work to recognize my patterns and triggers and examine them as honestly as I can without shame or judgment. And I do a lot of journaling. I feel like it sounds so simple when I just say it out loud, but it's honestly extremely challenging and takes a lot of fortitude. And I feel like this is an appropriate time to mention that the journey of recovery isn't linear. It's cyclical. It's not a straight line upward. It's a spiral. It's a returning again and again to deeper and deeper layers of self-awareness. It is messy sometimes, and the road gets bumpy. There are setbacks, there are struggles, and there are really hard lessons, but each one takes us deeper into wholeness. Carl Jung believed individuation to be a lifelong process. In that same light, recovery never ends. It isn't a one-time event. Rather, it's a continuous unfolding. So there you have it. For me, recovery is soul work. It is the art of retrieving what was once lost, reintegrating what was hidden, and living in union with the self and with spirit. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that is exactly what recovery means to me. It is the privilege of becoming who I truly am. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and that you got something meaningful out of it. If this resonated with you, I hope you'll be joining me again for the next one. Until then, remember, you're not alone, and there is always light at the surface.